Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another video for you. So, you've decided to join many others in the world of Azeroth as it was in 2004 to 2007, referred to as Vanilla or Classic. I'm sure you have many questions, the biggest of them probably being what class should I play? As you would imagine, classes have changed and evolved in a huge way over the years, almost unrecognizable from Classic to current. So in this video, I'd like to give a brief rundown of each one and go over their roles, responsibilities, niches, perks, and just how they played as a whole. Now, this is a pretty exhausted subject on YouTube, I think. Class guides are all over the place, but something I've noticed is that they're usually more aimed for the hardcore audience, with most of the talk being about the endgame and tier lists for DPS, healing, or tanking, aimed more at people who've maybe played on private servers for the past several years, or at least have a base knowledge of the game in its vanilla state. So since that's been covered really well by people much more knowledgeable than I, for this video I want to take a much more casual approach, assuming that the last time you played Classic was 12 years ago, or maybe you never had the chance to play it at all. I'll go over each class in the endgame and talk about their responsibilities and what roles that they generally landed in, but I won't go super detailed and get into spreadsheets or anything like that. So if you're looking for a very high level detailed guide with class rankings and whatnot, you probably won't find this video very enlightening. But if you just had the thought of, I'm not sure what class I want to play, let me search YouTube, this might be helpful to you. At least that's what I hope. The first thing I'll say is that each of these classes in the game have very specific roles that only they can fill. It's one of the more defining aspects of vanilla actually. Today, things have sort of melded together. Most classes are capable of really good AoE DPS, where maybe back then it was the mage's specialty, and today most classes have some form of stun, which was primarily a rogue attribute back then. Everyone is super mobile, has oh crap buttons, big DPS cooldowns. Everyone can do everything basically. This wasn't the case back then, and it has its good sides and downsides. A downside, obviously, is that the balance is questionable. There were certain specializations that you rarely saw because it was still the early stages, and a lot of this was still experimentation. But a good side was that the roles that you could fill were the roles that you could fill, no one else. It gave you more value and a sense of identity. People saw different classes join, and they reacted differently. It was something like, oh cool, a warlock. Now we can summon, and we also have that handy soul stone if we wipe. Or, oh nice, a shaman. Now we get to have that party-wide wind fury buff. I can guarantee you that this will be one of the first things that you notice if you pick up Classic, and it's part of what made it so special back then. Before we get into the classes though, I should also go over how talents worked, since I'll be mentioning specializations quite a bit. Talents back then were much different. You didn't outright pick a specialization which gave you certain spells. You had access to 90% of your class's abilities regardless of the spec, and putting points into certain trees would just increase the power of those abilities. For example, as a mage who has more points in the Frost tree, you still have Fireball, Fire Blast, Scorch, and Flame Strike and whatnot, but they just won't be as powerful as they would be if you had more points in the Fire tree. So later on, if I say Fire Mage or whatever, try to disassociate that with today's system where for the most part, Fire Mages just have fire spells, or only Assassination Rogues have poisons. Your toolkit is tied to your class, not your specialization. I just wanted to mention that, since it's one of the more confusing things for those who never played before the Cataclysm expansion. So, in no particular order, let's start with the Warlock. This is a pure DPS class that specializes in shadow and fire magic, and is supported with a wide variety of curses and other afflictions to wear down and debilitate your foes. You also have access to a varied selection of demons to accompany you in your journeys, each with their own role to fill. Their three specializations are Affliction, Destruction, and Demonology. Affliction improves your damage over time effects to give your enemies a slow but steady death. And Destruction more focuses on your big hitter spells such as Shadow Bolt or the instant cast Shadow Burn, a more direct way of dealing damage with big crits and much more volatility compared to Affliction. And as for Demonology, as you'd guess, this improves your ability to summon demons, increasing their health, damage, and much more. As for your roles, Warlocks are the ultimate wingman class. They're just great to have in the party. They're the only ones who can summon allies, which is especially important back then since meeting stones didn't summon, and with no flying, traveling was much more cumbersome in general. Their soul stone was quite unique and much more valuable back then as well. Only this and druids had the ability to resurrect during combat, although back then you had to apply the soul stone before the target died, so sort of a preemptive battle res. Most of the time though, you just threw it on a healer, and they only used it after a wipe so they could res up and save everyone a run back. They're also the only class that can reliably crowd control elementals with their banish spell, which was castable in combat and has no cooldown. You pretty much needed Warlocks for the Gar fight back then in the Molten Core. He had a bunch of mini elementals running around, and unless he had a bunch of tanks, it would be wise to have a few Warlocks on banish duty. They arguably have the most useful debuffs in the game, with curses that reduce the resistances of enemies, so all of your spellcasters can pump out more damage. Their Fierce spell is one of the better crowd controls, particularly for PvP. It's castable in combat and at range with no cooldown, and it didn't immediately break on damage, which made it very tough to deal with. And another defining spell is their Life Tap, which trades life for mana. Mana management wasn't just a thing for healers back in the day. DPS also had to use their resources wisely, or risk being unable to cast anything. Today, most DPS classes have it just to have it. It's inconsequential 99% of the time. The one exception, I think, is the Arcane Mage. So, if mana management isn't something that you're too keen on, Warlock is a great choice for this spell alone. It gave them an edge over other casters in the game. They could also make Hellstones, which were just as valuable back then as they are today. Vital to have, but realistically, you'd save them for the tanks because they required soul shards to make, which brings me to my next point. A quirk with Warlocks back then was that their soul shard system wasn't tied to your character like how it is now. Rather, it's an inventory item, and to gather them, you have to be draining the soul of a target when it died. Certain spells require these soul shards to cast. The Ritual of Summoning, Hellstones, Soul Stones, every demon summon excluding the Imp, and even combat spells such as Soulfire and Shadowburn. These took up an inventory slot, and back then, as infamous as it was, they didn't stack, so you were constantly playing this game of keeping an ample amount of these shards to make sure that you could cast all of your spells and make your stones and whatnot, and at the same time trying to save space for quest items and loot. So, some will find that aspect frustrating, but they're just so useful to have that it's completely worth it, I find. If your goal is to make friends in this game, I always say to make a tank, a healer, or a warlock. Any of those, and your friends list should fill up pretty quickly, because people will always want you around. So for endgame, you're a great support class, and you have great prospects in both PvE and PvP. Rating-wise, you are hindered a fair amount due to the debuff slot limit. Back then, your whole raid was limited to 16 debuffs on one target, so being a class that has a wide variety of damage over time spells and other debuffs, you may feel quite restricted in the raiding scene. If your focus is raiding, I think most Warlocks drift away from the Affliction tree in particular because of this limit, and they still do alright for themselves. But again, that's mainly raiding we're talking about here. Casual dungeons and PvP, it's no holds barred, so you're free to do whatever you want. Because of this, they're quite deadly in the PvP scene. You just have so many choices of abilities to cripple or encumber your enemies, and with mastery of all of your demon summons, you could overcome nearly any obstacle. So, just a great utility class, while still having some bite for actual DPS, which is why I like him so much. Since we're talking about DPS here though, another hugely different thing in Classic we need to talk about was threat. Today, it's really just the tank's responsibility to hold aggro on everything, and pretty easily done at that. You taunt it, and you have it forever unless you forget to press buttons. However, back in vanilla, it was more of a group effort. Remember that old Onyxia wipe animation?
We're going to DPS very, very slowly. Now. And by slowly, I mean fucking slow. If you get aggro, it means you're going to lose 50 DKP because you didn't know what the fuck to do.
He wasn't joking. Threat was much harder for tanks to get, and if the DPS went balls to the wall, they could very well rip aggro from the tank and wipe the entire raid. My guild personally did the 3 Sunder rule. Warriors had the Sunder armor ability, which was the main threat generator, and it stacked to 5, and usually when they got to 3, you were okay to start DPSing. Not necessarily pop all of your cooldowns and go ham, but you could at least start to ramp up at this point. So you have to take this into consideration when talking about DPS. Warlocks do great damage in the later tiers. Their shadow bolts hit extremely hard, but the downside is that they have little to no way of reducing their aggro other than just not attacking. There is an argument to be had between having medium damage and good aggro control versus high damage and no aggro control, so definitely consider that if you're looking for the class that deals the most damage. It's a double-edged sword. Next, we have the Mage. Anyone who's played RPGs before should know the basic gist of this class. You wear dresses, and you command the power of Frost, Fire, and Arcane to freeze, incinerate, and disintegrate your foes. Their playstyles are quite varied. Fire Spec is more based on huge bursty damage to kill your enemies in the blink of an eye. A lot of the old PvP videos, you'd have what were called 3-minute mages, where with cooldowns, you'd be able to insta-get people with giant pyroblasts. It's pretty much the definition of a glass cannon though, and you forego defense for the sake of all-out offense. If that's not your style though, you also have Frost, which is much more methodical and more catered towards defense through slows, roots, and barriers. You have much more control in general compared to the Fire Spec. And as for your Arcane School, this is where a lot of your utility spells lay. Just to throw out some examples, you have some supportive spells such as your Arcane Intellect, the ability to dampen and amplify magic. Dampen decreases magic damage and healing received, and Amplify does the opposite. You also have a shield, which absorbs damage in exchange for mana, the blink spell to create some distance, and some damaging spells such as the channeled arcane missiles for steady damage, or the AoE arcane explosion. They still had a lot of handy abilities that we have in the current game, the main ones being the ability to conjure food and water, and also portals to major cities. It's just that back then, with gold being so hard to come by, and traveling being so time consuming, they had much more value compared to today. Just keep in mind, if you play a mage and you're hanging out in your major city, you will be asked for food and portals. It's just a fact of life. Some of the more industrious mages even made quite a bit of gold selling portals to major cities back then. You needed a reagent to open one up, so there was some justification in charging a price for them. Their sheep spell was the most diverse and reliable crowd control in the game. No cooldown, castable at range, and it worked on humans and beasts, which most of the dungeons were comprised of, and combine that with the challenging nature of dungeons back then, and thus the need of CC, mages were always great to have in the group. And its usefulness in PvP is also pretty self-explanatory. In the raiding scene, you'd always want at least a few mages there for food and water, and for their damage too. As I remember, they did pretty good. An interesting quirk that I should mention though is that back then, and this is for any class, not just mages, but enemies did have resistances, so you might be stronger or weaker depending on what you're killing and how you're spec'd. For example, the Molten Core. Being the home of the elemental lord of fire, Ragnaros, it had many enemies who were resistant to fire magic, so a fire mage would find themselves quite weak here, as you would imagine. And elsewhere as a frost mage, there are some other fights that are unfriendly to them. It makes sense if you think about it, especially if you played the old Final Fantasies where you had to find an elemental enemy's weakness. It's just one of the old RPG elements that I thought was worth mentioning. Since mages have access to 3 schools of magic though, they can adapt a bit better than other classes. Whereas Warlock is mainly shadow and some fire, you can use fire, frost, or arcane, which gives them an edge in certain fights. The rogue's proficiencies lie in stealth, subterfuge, and assassination. They have a wide arsenal of stuns, slows, poisons, and other debilitating effects to ensure that they're always in firm control of any skirmish that they come across. That is, if they so choose to engage. Being just one of 2 classes to have the stealth ability, the rogues have the advantage of staying in the shadows and striking or disengaging when the time is right. Just the sound of a stealthed rogue nearby is enough to send chills down a player's spine because they know that they're being stalked, and at any moment you'd hear this. If your goal is to make other players angry and snap their keyboards in half, this is the class for you. They're offensive juggernauts, holding a wide variety of robust cooldowns to kill their enemies in the blink of an eye, and at the same time, many abilities and traits that made them extremely evasive and nimble. Because of this, they're extremely deadly in PvP in the right hands, and are considered among the best as DPS in the PvE scene as well. They use the energy and combo point system. You build up energy over time, and you have combo point builders and spenders as your resources. You have 3 specializations to choose from, and that's Assassination, Combat, and Subtlety. The Combat Rogue is a toe-to-toe swashbuckler designed to simply overpower your target, typically focusing on one-handed swords or maces, but there were some dagger builds as well. Usually though, if daggers were your weapon of choice, most of your points would land in the Assassination or Subtlety trees. Assassination increases your burst damage and improves your poisons, and Subtlety refines your stealth and your ability to sneak through the shadows, as well as giving you more cooldowns to set up more efficient kills. As for some of your specialties, you have the ability to pick locks, which can make certain dungeons easier or let you open up lockboxes. This is another skill that players would make gold from, offering to open lockboxes for a small sum. Another quirk with them was that to use your backstab or ambush abilities back then, you actually had to be behind your target. It does make sense, it is called backstab after all. So positioning was key, and if you or your opponent was lagging, PvP would be quite tricky to pull off sometimes. And as for leveling, as you would imagine, most rogues would invest points into the combat spec. It's hard to backstab when enemies are constantly facing you. They're also the only class that can disable traps, making them quite good for PvP, but even in certain areas in PvE as well. They have a wide variety of poisons at their disposal, as I said. In Classic, he actually had a whole profession to craft them. Direct damage, damage over time, slow, healing reduction, casting speed increase. Pick your poison. They're applicable on the fly, so you can adapt to any situation that's presented to you. And going into more detail with their evasiveness and defensive capabilities, you have Sprint, which increases your movement speed, Evasion, which increases your ability to dodge, and Vanish, which immediately puts you in stealth to hide yourself from your enemies. With these cooldowns, you can escape just about any situation, which is another reason why they're so deadly in PvP. Being able to choose your fights gives you such a huge advantage. Compared to other classes, they don't have as much utility in the realm of group buffs or long-lasting crowd control. Their weaknesses are they're cooldown dependent, And as far as everyday dungeon crowd controlling is concerned, they just have sap, which is only usable on humanoids, and without a certain talent, it breaks you out of stealth upon cast, which also makes it quite dangerous. I remember back then, sometimes to get in groups, people wanted me to have points in improved sap, but since it was quite deep into the subtlety tree, I never had it since it would hurt me in raiding. And respeccing back then was very costly. Their main saving grace is that their kick ability was the most reliable interrupt in the game, having a short cooldown and castable anytime as long as you had the energy. But where they maybe aren't as useful compared to a warlock or mage in group utility, they make up for in pure raw damage. They're famous for being one of the powerhouses of vanilla, and one of the reasons for that is because they excel at aggro control. They have the feint and vanish abilities in their toolkit, which complements their potential for high DPS really well because you have more freedom with how much you can actually attack without pulling aggro and wiping the entire raid. That's the main reason why I liked rogues so much back then, and why I rated as one for most of vanilla. So, PvE or PvP, you just can't go wrong with them. Truly a class to be feared when played properly. The hunter is an expert scout and marksman who favors a bow, gun, or crossbow as their weapon of choice, and are accompanied by their trusty companion pet. They're a fourth and final pure DPS class in the game, and they hold a wide variety of devastating ranged attacks to decimate their foes from a distance, and a small arsenal of traps to keep them out of harm's way. If that fails them, however, they have a respectable amount of melee strikes and a ferocity that's matched only by their beast companions. Bears, leopards, spiders, wolves, the wild holds endless potential allies for the hunter to tame. Some are as common as a household cat, and others are rare trophies that only the most patient can say that they've successfully domesticated. Your three specializations are marksmanship, beast mastery, and survival. Marksmanship, as you'd guess, improves your ability to attack from range, providing increases to your various stings, and even the aimed shot ability, which is a skill that takes a few seconds to line up a devastating hit. Beast mastery improves your animal companions and your bond with them, providing benefits for both the hunter and the pet. A signature spell being Bestial Wrath, which turns your pet into an unstoppable killing machine. And as for the survival tree, this houses many improvements to your traps, melee attacks, and just improves your control in general and your ability to kite. A highlight being your Wyvern Sting, which is a ranged attack that puts your target to sleep. Some of the unique things going on with them that you may have heard is the fact that they need ammo to fire their weapons. This was taken away in the Cataclysm expansion, but for bows and crossbows you needed arrows, and for guns you needed bullets to be able to attack. To help keep your bags clean, you also had access to special ammo pouches or quivers, which typically had higher capacity and also a boost to your ranged attack speed. You also had the ability to equip melee weapons in addition to your ranged. Since hunters really shined at range, these were mainly sought after for the stats more than anything. You may have heard people jokingly referring to every single weapon in the game as a hunter weapon. This is due to their tendency to take melee weapons with little regard to their comrades, even though they don't really use them, either due to selfishness or blissful ignorance. As for the pet system, this was also quite different at the time. Nowadays, pets share the same stats and DPS regardless of what you tame, but back in vanilla, each pet had unique stats. Some were more tanky, some had a really high attack speed, or maybe a slow speed but with high damage, or maybe they had certain unique abilities. For example, the turtles had a nice shield wall which made them quite nice for tanking enemies, and only the boars had a charge which would root enemies in place for a second, and wolves had a howl which would increase the damage of party members, and so on. There's way too many to list. The way you learn these skills was also pretty unique. Certain pets had certain ranks of these skills, and if you battled with them enough, you'd gain the ability to train their skills to other pets. It used skill points, and you had all sorts of abilities and buffs to choose from and customize your pet. Armor increases, certain resistances, and so on. You also had a happiness meter that you had to keep track of. There are 3 levels: unhappy, neutral, and happy, with a damage modifier of 75%, 100%, and 125% respectively. It decreased over time and was only increased through feeding your pet certain foods, and if your pet was unhappy for too long, it would actually abandon you, funny enough. How often you had to feed your pet was affected by the loyalty system, which was another quirk that they had. The longer you journeyed with your companion, the more loyal it became to you, and the less you had to feed it to keep it happy, and it goes on and on. It really had some Pokemon aspects to it. It was quite complicated back then, so it was kind of funny that newer players were often pointed towards Hunter as their first class. That's because they were easy to play at a very basic level, but looking past that, they're actually one of the hardest classes to master, I think. A contributing factor to that being their dead zone. Basically enemies who are too far to melee and too close to shoot. That's right, if enemies got up in your face, you're forced to bust out your melee weapons and deal with them that way, or find a way to get some range between you. This is pretty easy if you have a pet to taunt it off of you, but up until level 10 you're on your own, so it's a pretty tricky thing to deal with, especially in PvP. It's a constant battle of keeping other players out of melee range, and you can really notice as clear as day the difference between a good hunter and a bad hunter in a PvP setting. Another unique thing they have are traps. You do still have some of these today, depending on your spec, but I think the best way to put it is back then they were much more substantial, and that's because they were vital in keeping distance between you and your enemy, so with the removal of the dead zone, they kind of faded into the background. But back then, you had to master these things if you wanted to be a decent hunter. You had the normal freezing trap, which as you'd guess froze targets, and you also had your frost trap, which was your AoE slow, and there were some damaging ones. Immolation for a single target dot, and explosive for AoE. A cool set of abilities that helped define the class. And I mentioned this earlier, but hunters back then used mana as their resource, which will take a lot of people by surprise, I'm sure. So no more focus, which means proper mana management becomes an important aspect of the class as a whole. As for your endgame rolls, your DPS obviously, they aren't the most damaging in endgame rating, but they make up for it by bringing some great utility. You had Aspect of the Pack, which was a group-wide speed buff, the True Shot Aura, which was a group-wide attack power buff, Tranquilizing Shot to dispel enrages, and with your Eyes of the Beast, you made excellent trash and boss pullers, and with your tracking you could pinpoint the location of certain enemies. It was very common to have hunters as raid leaders back then, and it makes sense. They're the forward scouts of the game, leading their comrades through dangerous enemies and obstacles. They had great aggro control with their Feign Death ability, so if threat control is one of the more scary aspects of vanilla for you, they handle it quite nicely. Probably as good as rogues, if not better. And in PvP, they were quite deadly if they knew what they were doing. They were a threat to everyone. Any melee if they knew how to kite, healers with their mana drain, and even casters if they had the right pet pushing back their casts. I think if you had to pick just one class to describe as easy to learn and hard to master, it's the Hunter.
War. War never changes. Since the dawn of humankind, when our ancestors first discovered the killing power of rock and bone, blood has been spilled in the name of everything from God to justice to simple psychotic rage.
The quintessential melee class of any RPG, the warrior is a heavily armored juggernaut who doesn't rely on cunning nor magic. Rather, they favor their combat prowess and the hefty weight of sharp steel to cut through their enemies. whereas the cowardly hunters, mages, and warlocks take to running from their enemies, the warrior is the one who chases. No tricks, no ambiguity, just pure raw strength and a thirst for blood. Whether it's your enemies or your own is inconsequential, and that's because a unique thing they have going on is their rage system. Through attacking or being attacked, you generate the rage resource, which you build up over the course of a skirmish and spend on devastating melee attacks. Their 3 specializations are Arms, Protection, and Fury. Arms focuses mainly on improving your skill with two-handed blades, and some traits that focus on bleeding your enemies to death. It's generally the go-to for PvPers, with their biggest spell in this tree being the Mortal Strike, which reduces the effectiveness of healing, making them one of the few classes to counter healing in the game. Protection is their tank spec. They forego the two-hander for a sword and board, and focus on getting threat on enemies and soaking up damage. And Fury is pretty self-explanatory. This spec has a focus on dual wielding, and you buff yourself through the power of rage, getting some buffs from being hit, and sacrificing some survivability for damage. And although I did say dual wielding there are some builds that use two-handers in the Fury tree. One of their weird quirks back in Classic is their different stances. You have 3 of them, and that's Defensive, Battle, and Berserking. Each one has their own perks. Defensive increases your threat and reduces your damage taken, but it also reduces your damage dealt. As for Berserking, this gives you some crit, but increases your damage taken, and Battle Stance is middle of the ground. No benefits nor detriments. You also had certain abilities that you could use in certain stances. Some examples would be Disarm, which is only usable in Defensive, Overpower, which is Battle Stance only, or an Interrupt Shield Bash, which is usable in both Battle and Defensive stances. Particularly in PvP, it can make for a hectic time weaving between these 3 stances and adapting to what's going on around you, and since you lost all of your rage when switching, it was something that was pretty tricky to master too. You may have heard the term stance dancing before, and it's something that you'll have to learn for both PvE and PvP. So, not only are they relentless, but they also do very well at adapting to their surroundings and can buff their offense or defense on the fly. Damage-wise, they can really pump it out, and some see them as the best. Again, with quotes around best there, because like some other classes, a downside is that they don't really have any way to get rid of aggro. So, you have to be very careful at the same time. And as for tanking, a lot of you probably know that warriors are the tanks for vanilla. In full plate and with a shield, they're just unbeatable at soaking up damage. Whether it's passive or active mitigation, they're the kings of Classic, and at the same time, with their huge arsenal of taunts and threat generators, they also excelled at holding aggro, which wasn't so easy back then. The better your tank is, the better your raid is, because your DPS can let loose a bit more, and single target or AoE, warriors were great at holding aggro. And if you want to play one for damage, PvE or PvP, you can't go wrong. Calling upon the power of holy magic to protect and replenish their allies, the priest has the reputation of being one of the most resourceful healers in Classic. They're as good as healing as warriors are at tanking, and if that's not your cup of tea, drawing upon the power of shadow, they're more than capable of dealing out damage and melting faces. Your 3 specializations are Holy and Discipline, which are based around healing, and Shadow, which is for damage. Let's cover healing first. Due to their flexibility and raw healing power, every raid will have a hefty supply of priests there to keep everyone alive. Big slow cast heals that you can buffer, fast flash heals that you can react with quickly, an area of effect heal, a heal over time to keep things steady, the ability to dispel harmful effects from allies and beneficial effects from enemies, and a boon to stamina, and even a shield to prevent damage. You name it, the priest has it, and it's this extreme versatility is why they're considered the quote best healer by many. As for the differences between the 2 specs, Holy is more of a direct healing tree, while Discipline is more of an increase in supportive stuff like buffs. In Discipline, you have Power Infusion, which increases spell damage and healing on your target, and Divine Spirit, which increases a player's spirit. And in the Holy Tree, you have some passive boosts to healing in general, and even the Spirit of Redemption, which allows you to heal allies from beyond the grave. So it's another preference sort of thing. Do you want raw healing, or a bit of added support? And I am saying Holy or Discipline here, but again, with the classic talent system, it's not that simple. Usually people say that since you have more points in one tree than the other, so when I say Holy Spec, it might be something like 30 points in the Holy Tree, and like 21 or something in Discipline, so it's not an all or nothing deal. And that goes for any class really. As for their DPS spec, Shadow, you throw away the Divine in favor of Dark Shadow magic to melt faces. The way you deal the damage is pretty varied, kind of a hybrid between Warlocks and Mages in a way. You get a damage over time, a hard hitter, and a channeled spell, so it's a nice mix for a lot of people, and with shields and the ability to heal if you step out of Shadow form, pretty good survivability too. Because of all of this, they're juggernauts in PvP. I actually fear them more than rogues, if I'm gonna be honest. They do have a spot in raiding, but their biggest weakness is their mana. They run out quite quickly, so I personally saw them very rarely in my guild. I do know that they give a nice debuff that increases shadow damage taken, so you probably want at least one Shadow Priest in the raid for that, if nothing else, so you do have an important role to fill in the PvE scene. A quirk with them is that Shadow form that I mentioned. Today is just something that you want to have on because it gives you some spell damage, but in Classic, in addition to the damage, this form would lock you out of most of your healing spells actually. You can only use any shadow-based spell and your shield, and if you want to heal, you have to exit the form and then patch yourself up, and then re-enter it. It's extremely tough on your mana, and should only be used as a last resort. So, replenishing allies with holy spells, or torturing foes with dark shadow magic. The ultimate yin-yang class that packs a punch on both sides of the coin. The jack of all trades and the master of none, the druid is the ultimate hybrid class of the game. Being one with nature itself, they can take on the form of many different beasts to adapt to any situation. The healer goes down, or they run out of mana in a dungeon, back up a bit and spot heal. Or maybe the tank went down, so you just go bare form, pop cooldowns, and try to weather the storm. They're a great choice for players wanting to do a little bit of everything. Certainly the most nimble out of all of the classes with their travel form, which makes them second to none in escaping sticky situations or running flags in the Warsong Gulch. Your three specializations are Restoration for healing, Feral for melee DPS and tanking, and Balance for caster DPS. Let's cover healing first. Your toolkit consists of 2 heals over time, 1 standalone and another through a flash heal, an instant cast heal, a slower big heal, and a few others. Their toolkit isn't as diverse as a priest, but they make up for it in other ways. Now this isn't tied to just restoration, but one of the nifty things that you have is your battle res, Rebirth. Like I mentioned earlier, the Warlock and Druid are the only classes capable of resurrecting players in combat, the former having to preemptively cast a Soul Stone before the target dies. This itself is extremely useful as you would imagine, and it can save you a wipe if your tank goes down. And not only that, but you also have the Innervate spell, which buffs mana regeneration and is castable on anyone. So where some may say that they lack the raw healing power of priests, they make up for in utility and support, and are always great to have in the raid. And they also have some pretty good crowd control capabilities. Their roots can take any melee out of the equation as long as you're outdoors, and they also have the Hibernate spell for beasts and dragonkin. And they also have the Mark of the Wild, which is a pretty important buff, increasing your armor, attributes, and resistances of you and your group mates. Another quirk with them, this time a negative though, is that they don't have a normal out-of-combat resurrect, believe it or not. In raiding, it doesn't really matter because you're gonna have priests and paladins anyways, but for dungeons, if you had a druid healer, you had to sort of account for that and make sure that you bring a class that's capable of rezzing, such as a paladin or a shadow priest or something. My first character that I leveled back in 05 was a paladin, and the first group of friends that I made had a druid healer, so they'd always bring me along for my charming personality first off, but also because I could actually resurrect out of combat. So just something to keep in mind. It is a turnoff for a lot of people. Another thing I should mention, and this was true for any class with heals over time, is that a player can only have one of these active on them at any given point. That's right, if you had 2 druids, only the most potent rejuvenation would stick on your target, and the weaker one would get a message saying that a more powerful one is already active. This limit would only be removed in patch 2.0.1, which was the Burning Crusade pre-patch. I don't want to say that druids were built around these heals over time back then, as they are now. I mean, they only had 2, but they were the ones who were the most affected by this one hot limit, so they do take a hit there. As for the feral spec, this is a little tricky since it's for tanking and DPS. This tree buffs your bear form for tanking, and cat form for DPS. In bear form, you get rage just like a warrior, and you maul your enemies to death basically. They have a lot of trade-offs compared to the warrior. On one hand, druids have some self-healing, and they're immune to polymorph, and are much more mobile in general, but on the other hand, they're a bit squishy compared to warriors since they can't block nor parry, and they lack big defensive cooldowns such as the Last Stand or Shield Wall. But on your mutant third hand, they have the ability to step out and decurse, battle res, or innervate when needed, so it's whatever your preference is. As far as raiding is concerned, people generally defaulted to warriors over druids. You will see druids tanking certain fights, but since warriors are so good in general, they kind of take the back seat to them. As for your cat DPS, similar to the rogue, you use the energy and combo point system. Very similar abilities to the rogue, with bleeds and backstabs and whatnot. And rating wise, they kind of have a similar thing going on here though. They have their roles certainly, but they don't scale the best as I remember, so you may find it harder to get into a raiding group compared to, say, a rogue for instance. As for balanced druids, you summon the power of nature itself to take down your enemies, and buff your nature and arcane abilities such as Moonfire, Wrath, and Starfire. And if you invest enough points into the tree, you get the Moonkin form, which gives you and your party members some spell crit. If your concern is raiding, they fell under the same curse as Shadow Priests. Their biggest weakness is that they ran out of mana quite quickly. Their Moonkin form is jokingly referred to as Oomkin because they'd constantly be out of mana. So, you know the saying, the jack of all trades and the master of none. It's not without its downsides. While they are technically capable of several roles, a lot of the times in regards to raiding, they fall into healing primarily. But that is just talking raiding there. I'm sure a lot of you don't even plan on doing that endgame, maybe preferring PvP or just some casual dungeon running. If that's the case, you have a bit more freedom in a lot of ways, so you should follow your heart and do what you want. Well, you should do that anyways in fact, and with the druid, you have a lot of options in that regard since they're so versatile. The kings of support in my book. Paladins do battle to protect the world from the forces of shadow. Powerful warriors in their own right, they can also call upon the light to heal wounds, create shields of force, and incinerate evil creatures. At least that's what their official description says. You wear heavy plate, and judging from your spellbook, you have a strange infatuation with fists and hammers. You're the judge, jury, and executioner, with emphasis on the latter. And your 3 specializations are Retribution for DPS, Protection for tanking, and Holy for healing. For Retribution, you pick up a 2-hander and unleash some righteous smiting on your enemies, and for Protection, you pick up a sword and board, and with the power of light, protect yourself and your allies from harm. And with Holy, you call upon the power of, well, holy magic to keep your allies alive. This class has also changed quite a bit over the years, rivaling the Hunter even. Some of the cool quirks that you have are your blessings. The Paladin has access to a plethora of buffs to aid your group mates. Attack power, stat increases, threat reduction, and much more. Something you may have heard is that these were relentlessly annoying to keep up since they had a 5-minute duration, and with 40-man raids, it's quite a lot of buffing, but luckily, Classic is based off of patch 1.12, where you had the greater blessings, which cost a reagent to cast, but also they had durations of 15 minutes. So these blessings in general are very useful for dungeons, raids, PvP, solo play, whatever. They were one of the more defining aspects of the class, and it made them great group mates actually. And another unique thing they got going on are their auras. These are party-wide buffs that increase armor, resistances to certain schools of magic, a thorns buff that deals damage to attackers, and so on. They were just as essential as the blessings, especially those resistances, since there were some fights that were based around stacking them. And next, we have the seal system. Basically, these were enhancements to your melee attacks that did a variety of things. We have some extra holy damage per swing, some healing per swing, maybe some mana, and tied to each of these seals was a judgment effect. Essentially, if you cast the judgment spell on an enemy, you got another effect unique to each seal. For example, with that healing seal I mentioned earlier, it debuffs the enemy and any ally hitting it will now get some healing per melee attack. And it's the same for the mana seal, and for the holy damage one, it just does some straight instant holy damage. And there's a bunch of other cool effects for all of the other seals. It's a really unique system that was chipped away over the years, ultimately seeing an end in the Legion expansion, I think, and it's another one that really defines the class and stops them from being labeled as just a warrior who can heal. And their job description isn't just for show. Being warriors of light, they have an edge against the unholy undead and demons of the world through some exclusive spells that are only usable against these enemy types. So kind of a unique benefit that they brought to the table whenever you were running a dungeon or a raid that was filled with undead or demons. And another unique thing is that they're alliance only. That's another wild thing that a lot of people didn't know, I think. How could you have a class that's only available to one faction? Isn't that imbalanced? Well, it's vanilla World of Warcraft. Believe it or not, strange elements such as this weren't sacrificed for the sake of that hyper-balance that you see in the current game. Again, good sides and downsides, but that's just how it was. Some fights, the Alliance simply had it easier than the Horde, and vice versa with the Horde Shaman, which I'll talk about in a bit. First though, I wanted to get into their specializations a bit more, starting with Holy. As I said, in regards to just raw healing, most people will tell you that priests are the kings of Classic. Paladin healing is very straightforward. You have a big slow cast heal and a flash heal, and if you spec into it, an instant cast. That's pretty much it for their direct heals, but combined with those blessings that I mentioned earlier, it's certainly enough. Retribution spec takes on a two-hander, as I said, and they deal a combination of physical and magic damage through that seal system. The Seal of Command, which is found in the Retribution tree, is usually their seal of choice. This has a chance to proc extra attacks, so they could get quite bursty, and combined with their heavy plate and their ability to heal themselves, and other spells such as their bubble and lay on hands, they're quite tough to kill. It always seems like you have to kill a paladin like 3 times to actually kill him, which makes them quite dangerous in PvP. Rating-wise, they're rare to see since their overall damage wasn't the best, but PvP was another story. Pretty tough to fight. As for protection paladins, they're quite good at AoE tanking threat-wise, but their big problem is that they don't have a taunt, which is crucial. If enemies got off of them, it's a struggle to get them back, and it's something that gets worse over time as your DPS gets more and more geared. Their way of getting aggro was just a threat increase buff, so they had a hard time single target tanking threat-wise. And since they of course use mana as their resource, running out is always a danger that you have to keep in mind. So, rating-wise, most paladins landed in the healer role, since that's what they excelled at. Again, play what you want. If you want to be Retribution or Protection, I'm sure you'll find guilds who'll take you in, It's just that it's going to be harder compared to a Holy Paladin. It all depends on your endgame goal, really. The only sure thing is if you enjoy fists, hammers, and righteous smiting, this is the class for you. Commanding the power of earth, fire, wind, and water, shamans manipulate the elements themselves to their will. And through the aid of their sacred totems, which provide boons to the shaman and their allies, they're considered to be one of the best support classes in the game, while still packing a mean punch on their own. They're the horde counterpart of the Alliance's paladin, and they typically fall into the damage or healing roles. Their three specializations are elemental, enhancement, and restoration. Restoration, as you'd guess, is for healing. Enhancement is a melee-based DPS spec, which specializes in, well, weapon enhancements, hence the name. And elemental is for caster DPS, making use of nearly every element. As for what separates them from everyone else, we have their totem system. They do still have these today, but like much else, they're a shadow of their former selves. Back then, you had a huge variety of special totems of each element: fire, earth, water, and air, and they all did different things. Fire totems were for damage mainly, either direct or AoE, and water was more inclined for healing or mana regeneration, and earth and air enhanced you and your party members in various ways. Now, it would be exhausting to list every single one, but you had totems that buffed the weapons of your party members with Wind Fury, giving their melee attacks a chance to proc extra attacks. That was quite a popular one. You had one that broke fear, charm, and sleep effects for all group members every few seconds, which was extremely useful, and you had some that increased your stats, such as strength or agility, or others that reduced your damage taken, taunted enemies, increased resistances, and one that you could use as a sentry. Put it at a choke point of a battleground to give ample warning of an incoming attack. In essence, there are a huge variety, and they really made the class quite unique. This class was also distinct due to the fact that they had 2 lives. With their reincarnation passive, once every hour, you have the ability to resurrect yourself on the spot and haunt your enemies from beyond the grave. And as for their playstyles and roles, as I said, 2 DPS. Enhancement was originally designed to be for tanking actually, but it ended up being used for melee DPS more often than not. Your main damage came from those weapon enhancements, mainly Wind Fury, which gave you those extra attacks. These could get quite ridiculous because they could proc off of each other. One of my favorite PvP videos back then was Unbreakable the Shaman. He had the legendary Hand of Ragnaros 2-hander, and he fully displayed just how crazy enhancement shamans could be. Now, it is sort of a slot machine. Most fights didn't end with a single swing, so just keep in mind the power of video editing, but some people like that style because it's really satisfying when the stars do align and you just chunk your enemies. There are other choices though. You have Rockbiter, which increases melee attack power, but also threat, a remnant of their intended role of tanking, and also Flame Tongue, which gives some extra fire damage, and Frostbrand, which deals some frost damage, and also slows enemies. It's not just all auto-attacking though. You do have quite the variety of spells to support and complement your melee, such as Frost Shock for slows, Earth Shock for interrupts, some self-heals, and combined with your totems, you're quite versatile actually. If consistent damage is more your speed, you may enjoy Elemental. This focuses on magic damage of course. They're still bursty, and they pack quite a punch, but compared to Enhancement, it's more controlled through the use of cooldowns and trinkets. Their big one being their Elemental Mastery buff, which made you see some big numbers. A more durable caster DPS with their ability to wear mail armor, and with their Ghost Wolf form and various slows, pretty slippery too. As for heals, we have the Restoration spec. You have the normal stuff that you'd expect. You got a quick panic heal, and a slower but bigger one, and even a totem that heals party members. Something that made them quite good though is their chain heal. AoE healing wasn't really a thing at the time, and this spell was great for that very thing, so it kinda made him specialize in group healing. And combined with your totems, you are an extremely valuable class in both PvE and PvP. They're a bit too good though, because like druids, paladins, and priests, in the raiding scene, they're most commonly healers. Enhancement has damage troubles, and much like the Shadow Priest, Elemental has mana problems, so a lot of the time if you are raiding, you are healing. Compared to the other classes, I think you're able to find groups more easily as a shaman, since their totems are so good. I mean, you're gonna have the easiest time trying to get in as a healer, but if you're bringing Wind Fury or extra mana or a Fear Breaker to the table, I think your chances are pretty good. Arguably the best support class in the game, so if that's your cup of tea, you'll be very happy with this choice, I think. But that's about it. Those are all 9 classes of vanilla World of Warcraft. Their strengths, their weaknesses, and just the weird quirks that they had back then. I hope that this video at least gave you a general feel of how they all play and what roles they fill. Again, I didn't want to go too hardcore with endgame and DPS or healing rankings because I just wanted to cover their playstyles more and the things that made them unique. I mean, this video is nearly an hour long already, so I probably went on for too long anyways. It's kind of funny how I set out for this to be a casual guide, but here we are at 50 minutes, so I guess I'll just sign off here. Do what you will with the information I provided. I hope that it helps you in narrowing down your choice for whatever you want to play. Check out the comments, as people usually have useful information that I missed or got wrong. And the next question is usually, well, what race should I pick? Well, say no more. Luckily, I already have full guides for that made for both the Horde and the Alliance. Some races do synergize well with these classes more so than others, which may or may not be important to you. If it is, I'll have some links for you in the description of this video, so feel free to check those out. I hope you found the video helpful though, like it if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.